For 36 years, from 1787 to 1823, wealthy families across colonial America sent their troublesome sons to St. Augustine Seminary in Virginia for religious education and spiritual correction. Not a single one of those young men ever returned home. Church records show 247 students enrolled during this period, yet 0 graduated as ordained priests. What happened to them remained a mystery until 1998, when renovation workers discovered documents that revealed the seminary was actually an elaborate prison and extortion operation disguised as religious education. Few channels dare to tell this story because the Sterling family's influence still runs deeper than most realize. Before we continue with the story of Father Edmund Sterling and his unholy seminary, make sure to subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell, because this type of content is only for true mystery investigators. And tell us in the comments, from which state are you listening to this tale? The Sterling family had always understood that knowledge was the most dangerous inheritance of all. Colonial Virginia in 1787 was a land of vast plantations, growing tobacco fortunes, and families whose wealth depended on secrets best left buried. The Tidewater region, with its maze of rivers and isolated estates, provided the perfect cover for those who preferred to conduct their business away from prying eyes. It was here, in Henrico County, that the Sterling family had established themselves as pillars of both commerce and faith. Edmund Sterling, born in 1751, was the third son of a tobacco merchant who had made his fortune through methods that polite society chose not to examine too closely. Unlike his brothers, who inherited the family's legitimate businesses, Edmund was gifted with something far more valuable: an understanding of human nature's darkest corners and an ability to exploit them with surgical precision. When he announced his intention to establish a Catholic seminary in Protestant Virginia, his family saw it as an embarrassing religious fervor. They had no idea it would become the foundation of the most profitable criminal enterprise in colonial America. St. Augustine Seminary was built in 1786 on 340 acres of dense woodland, far enough from Richmond to ensure privacy, close enough for wealthy families to visit their sons. The Gothic stone buildings, imported craftsmen, and genuinely impressive library gave it the appearance of scholarly legitimacy. Edmund Sterling, who had studied briefly at the College of William and Mary before claiming a religious calling, styled himself as Father Sterling, and surrounded himself with a small staff of men whose past credentials were as questionable as their present loyalties. The seminary's reputation spread quickly through the network of Virginia's elite families. Here was a Catholic institution run by a man of impeccable breeding, offering to educate young men who had proven problematic for their families. Sons who asked too many questions about business practices, who had witnessed things they shouldn't have, or who possessed information that could destroy family fortunes. The seminary promised not just education, but discretion, isolation, and most importantly, transformation. What these families didn't realize was that Father Sterling had no intention of educating their sons in theology. He was far more interested in educating himself about their family's secrets, their business dealings, and most crucially, exactly how much they would pay to keep certain information buried forever. The first students arrived in the spring of 1787, 12 young men between the ages of 16 and 23, sent by families whose names appeared on shipping manifests, land deeds, and government contracts throughout Virginia and the Carolinas. Each family paid the substantial enrollment fee of £50 sterling, enough to build a small house, and promised additional contributions for their son's spiritual development. They believed they were investing in discretion and redemption. In reality, they were financing their own destruction. The autumn of 1789 brought the first hint that something at St. Augustine Seminary was fundamentally wrong, though it would take decades for anyone to piece together the full scope of Father Sterling's operation. Jonathan Whitmore, eldest son of a Charleston shipping magnate, had been enrolled at the seminary after discovering discrepancies in his father's cargo manifests. Discrepancies that suggested the family business included more than tobacco and rice. When October came and went without the customary letter home, the Whitmore family dispatched their trusted overseer, Thomas Hartwell, to check on their son's progress. What Hartwell found at St. Augustine defied explanation. The seminary appeared to be functioning normally. He could hear the sound of evening prayers drifting from the chapel, see light in the study hall windows, observe the daily routines of a religious institution. But when he requested to see Jonathan specifically, Father Sterling's response was peculiar. The young man was in deep spiritual retreat, Sterling explained, having experienced a profound religious awakening that required complete isolation from worldly concerns, including family correspondence. Hartwell, a man who had spent 30 years managing the Whitmore family's more delicate affairs, recognized evasion when he heard it. He requested to at least glimpse Jonathan during evening prayers to assure the family of his well-being. Father Sterling agreed, but with an odd condition. Hartwell must observe from the back of the chapel in shadow and must not attempt to make contact. That evening, as twilight gathered around the stone walls of St. Augustine, Hartwell positioned himself in the chapel's rear alcove. What he witnessed would haunt him for the remaining days of his life, though he would never fully understand what he had seen. The young men filing into evening prayers moved with an unnatural uniformity, their faces bearing expressions of serene compliance that seemed almost vacant. They responded to the liturgy in perfect unison, never glancing toward the visitors section, never showing the restlessness or individual quirks one would expect from young men confined together. Most disturbing of all, when Hartwell counted the participants, he found only 19 figures in the pews, though Father Sterling had claimed to have 37 students enrolled. Among those 19 faces in the dim candlelight, Hartwell thought he recognized Jonathan Whitmore. But the young man who had left Charleston as a spirited, rebellious heir apparent now sat with the glassy-eyed devotion of a man who had forgotten his own name. When Hartwell returned to Charleston and reported his observations to the Whitmore family, they faced an impossible choice. Their son appeared to be alive and well, receiving the spiritual guidance they had requested. But something fundamental had changed in him, and demanding his immediate return might provoke questions about why he had been sent away in the first place. The Whitmores chose silence, as Father Sterling had calculated they would. They continued their payments to St. Augustine Seminary, telling themselves and their social circle that Jonathan had found his calling in religious life. It was easier than confronting the alternative, that they had delivered their firstborn son into the hands of something far worse than the scandal they had sought to avoid. Over the following months, similar scenes played out across Virginia's network of powerful families. Sons who had been sent to St. Augustine for spiritual correction were writing letters home, but the letters were strangely uniform in their expressions of devotion and contentment. Parents who visited found their children changed in ways that couldn't quite be articulated, more compliant, less curious, eerily at peace with their circumstances. None of these families spoke to each other about their concerns. The very nature of why their sons had been sent to St. Augustine ensured that silence was preferable to investigation. And Father Sterling counted on that silence as carefully as he counted the increasing fees he charged for their sons' continued spiritual development. As the 1790s progressed, St. Augustine Seminary's reputation grew among Virginia's elite circles, but always in whispered conversations and coded recommendations. The institution had become something unique in colonial society, a place where inconvenient sons could be sent without the social stigma of public scandal or the permanent separation of disinheritance. The families who utilized Father Sterling's services found themselves trapped in a web of mutual complicity. Each had sent a son to St. Augustine for reasons they couldn't publicly acknowledge, creating a network of shared secrets that bound them to silence. The Randolph family had enrolled their youngest after he discovered his uncle's slave trading. Routes violated both Virginia law and family reputation. The Carters sent their heir apparent when he began asking questions about missing tenant farmers on their Rappahannock plantations. The Birds delivered their son after he witnessed a midnight meeting that connected his father to a series of accidental deaths among business rivals. What none of these families realized was that Father Sterling was methodically documenting every secret, every scandal, every piece of compromising information that had led to their son's enrollment. His private study, located in the seminary's tower room, contained detailed files on each family's vulnerabilities, complete with names, dates, locations, and witness testimonies provided by their own children during spiritual counseling sessions. The transformation process that students underwent at St. Augustine was gradual and carefully orchestrated. New arrivals were initially housed in comfortable quarters and treated with apparent respect. They attended genuine theological classes taught by Father Sterling, who was surprisingly knowledgeable despite his questionable credentials. The food was excellent, the library well-stocked, and the daily routine structured but not oppressive. But within weeks of arrival, subtle changes began. Students would mention feeling unusually tired during their letters home, attributing it to the rigorous spiritual schedule. Their handwriting began to change, becoming more uniform and controlled. Their letters grew shorter and more formulaic, expressing gratitude for their family's wisdom in sending them to such a beneficial institution. What the students didn't know was that their evening wine was being supplemented with carefully measured doses of laudanum and other opiates available to those with medical connections. The dosages were precise enough to create dependency and docility without obvious signs of drug use. Combined with isolation from outside contact and constant reinforcement of their family's disappointment in their past behavior, the chemical influence created young men who were increasingly compliant and decreasingly capable of independent thought. By 1793, Father Sterling had refined his system to the point where he could predict almost exactly how long it would take to break down a new arrival's resistance and rebuild them into the compliant figure their family would expect to see during rare visits. The process typically took between 4 and 8 months, depending on the student's initial personality and the severity of the secrets they carried. But Sterling's true genius lay not in controlling the students, but in controlling their families. As months turned to years, the fees for continued enrollment began to increase. What had started as an annual tuition of £50 sterling gradually escalated to hundreds, then thousands of pounds, justified by expanded spiritual programs and advanced theological studies. Families found themselves paying not just for their sons' education, but for their continued silence about family secrets that had been extracted during those early counseling sessions. When parents protested the increasing costs or demanded their son's return, Father Sterling would gently remind them of conversations their children had shared during spiritual direction. Conversations about business practices, family histories, or witnessed events that could destroy reputations and fortunes. If they became public knowledge, the choice was always presented delicately but clearly: continue supporting their son's spiritual journey, or risk having their family's darkest secrets exposed to Virginia society. Most families paid. By the winter of 1798, 11 years after St. Augustine Seminary's founding, Father Sterling's operation had evolved into something far more sophisticated than simple extortion. He had created what he privately termed the Virginia Arrangement, a network of interconnected blackmail schemes that controlled nearly 24 of the colony's most powerful families. The system worked with clockwork precision. Students who, had been at the seminary for several years were gradually moved from the main dormitories to private quarters in the basement levels, ostensibly for advanced contemplative studies. These basement rooms, carved from the natural limestone beneath the building, were comfortable enough to avoid obvious signs of imprisonment, but were secured in ways that made escape impossible. The students in these lower levels rarely appeared at public prayers anymore, as their spiritual advancement had supposedly progressed beyond communal worship. Meanwhile, new students continued to arrive regularly, maintaining the seminary's facade of ongoing operation while providing fresh sources of family intelligence and additional revenue streams. Father Sterling had become expert at identifying which young men possessed the most dangerous knowledge about their family's affairs, and these individuals found their spiritual retreats became increasingly permanent. The transformation of Charles Randolph, enrolled in 1796, illustrated Sterling's evolving methods with chilling clarity. Charles had been sent to St. Augustine after discovering that his father's tobacco exports were being used to launder profits from illegal slave trading operations that violated both Virginia statutes and federal maritime law. Initially, Charles's letters home expressed the usual complaints about strict religious discipline and homesickness. But as months passed, his correspondence became increasingly supportive of his family's business practices, including explicit approval of trading arrangements he had previously condemned. When Thomas Jefferson Randolph, Charles's younger brother, visited the seminary in early 1799, he found Charles transformed into an articulate advocate for the family's commercial interests. Charles spoke knowledgeably about crop rotations, shipping schedules, and labor management, practices that would maximize profitability while minimizing legal exposure. His previous moral objections to the family's slave trading connections had apparently been resolved through intensive theological study of biblical slavery passages. But Thomas Jefferson Randolph was more observant than most visitors to St. Augustine. He noticed that his brother's pupils were consistently dilated despite the bright daylight in the visiting room. He observed that Charles's hands shook slightly when he wasn't actively engaged in conversation. Most telling, when Thomas mentioned their childhood dog's name, Charles showed no recognition of a pet they had both adored for 7 years. These observations might have remained private family concerns, but Thomas Jefferson Randolph made a decision that would ultimately unravel Father Sterling's entire operation. Instead of confronting his family directly about his brother's condition, he began his own investigation into St. Augustine Seminary's practices and history. Thomas was uniquely positioned for such an investigation. As a junior partner in his family's shipping business, he had access to commercial records, correspondence networks, and business connections throughout Virginia and the Carolinas. More importantly, he had inherited his grandfather's meticulous record-keeping habits and his father's suspicious nature regarding financial arrangements that seemed too convenient to be legitimate. Over the following months, Thomas traced the financial relationships between St. Augustine Seminary and nearly 24 prominent families. He discovered that tuition payments had escalated far beyond any reasonable educational costs, and that many families were making additional donations for specialized services that were never clearly defined. He found shipping records indicating that supplies delivered to the seminary included unusual quantities of medical equipment, pharmaceutical materials, and construction materials more appropriate for prison construction than educational facilities. Most significantly, Thomas began tracking the students who had supposedly graduated or left St. Augustine over its 11-year history. What he discovered was deeply disturbing. While 247 young men had been enrolled at the seminary, fewer than 24 had ever been documented as returning to their families or pursuing careers elsewhere. The vast majority seemed to have simply vanished from all public records after their enrollment. This was when Thomas Jefferson Randolph realized that his brother Charles might not be the victim of unusual religious indoctrination, but of something far more sinister. Thomas Jefferson Randolph's investigation took a dangerous turn in the spring of 1799 when he discovered that he wasn't the only person asking questions about St. Augustine Seminary. Through his shipping business connections, he learned that several other families had privately commissioned discreet inquiries into the institution, all reporting similar concerns about their sons' transformations and the seminary's ever-increasing financial demands. But these families were discovering what Thomas had already suspected, that investigating Father Sterling meant risking exposure of the very secrets that had led them to send their sons away in the first place. Every inquiry into the seminary's practices opened doors that most families preferred to keep locked forever. The breakthrough came when Thomas connected with Martha Henley, the widow of a Williamsburg physician who had died under suspicious circumstances in 1797. Dr. Henley had been one of the few medical professionals willing to treat patients discreetly, asking no questions about unusual injuries or conditions that wealthy families preferred not to explain. His patient records, which Martha had inherited along with substantial debts, included several entries for consultations at St. Augustine Seminary. According to Dr. Henley's notes, Father Sterling had requested medical advice regarding the long-term effects of opiate administration on young men, specifically seeking information about dosages that would create dependency without causing obvious physical deterioration. The doctor's records showed multiple visits to the seminary between 1794 and 1796, during which he had examined students who showed signs of chronic drug administration but were apparently being presented as suffering from spiritual melancholia or religious ecstasy. More disturbing were Dr. Henley's final entries regarding St. Augustine, dated just weeks before his sudden death from what was officially ruled a heart attack. The physician had begun expressing concerns about the ethical implications of his consultations with Father Sterling, noting that several students he had examined appeared to be suffering from more than spiritual distress. His last entry regarding the seminary was a single line: "The Sterling arrangement represents a fundamental violation of both medical ethics and human dignity." When Thomas Jefferson Randolph shared Dr. Henley's records with Martha, she revealed that her husband had been planning to report his concerns about St. Augustine to colonial authorities before his unexpected death. She had suspected that his demise was connected to his growing moral objections to his work with Father Sterling, but had lacked the evidence or social standing to pursue an investigation. Together, Thomas and Martha began developing a strategy to expose St. Augustine Seminary's true nature. But they were operating under severe constraints. Any public revelation would destroy the families whose sons were imprisoned there, including Thomas's own family. They needed to find a way to rescue the students without exposing the secrets that had led to their imprisonment. Their solution was both elegant and dangerous. Thomas would use his shipping business to arrange for an accidental discovery of the seminary's illegal activities by colonial authorities, while Martha would ensure that medical evidence of the student's condition would be available to support legal action against Father Sterling. But as they finalized their plans, they made a chilling discovery that changed everything they thought they knew about St. Augustine Seminary. While reviewing Dr. Henley's patient files one final time, Martha found a hidden compartment in her husband's medical bag containing documents that revealed the true scope of Father Sterling's operation. The seminary wasn't just imprisoning inconvenient sons and extorting their families. It was systematically eliminating students who proved too resistant to chemical control or who retained too much dangerous knowledge about their family's secrets. The documents included detailed anatomical drawings and medical notes describing what Dr. Henley termed staged accidents, designed to eliminate specific students while maintaining plausible deniability. The physician had apparently been coerced into providing medical expertise for murders disguised as accidental deaths, suicides, or natural causes related to the student's supposed spiritual afflictions. Among these documents was a list of names, students who had been eliminated over the seminary's 11-year history. The list included 23 names, matching exactly the number of death certificates that had been issued for St. Augustine students. But more terrifying was a second list, labeled pending resolution, which included 12 names of current students, including Charles Randolph. Thomas Jefferson. Randolph realized that his brother wasn't just imprisoned at St. Augustine Seminary, he was scheduled for execution. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Virginia's hills intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries, hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next in this tale of human greed and corruption. The race to save Charles Randolph and the other condemned students had begun, but Thomas and Martha were about to discover that Father Sterling had been anticipating their investigation all along. On the night of May 17, 1799, Thomas Jefferson Randolph and Martha Henley approached St. Augustine Seminary with a desperate plan to rescue the imprisoned students before Father Sterling could carry out his final solution. What they discovered in the limestone chambers beneath the seminary would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives and reveal the true scope of one of colonial America's most systematic criminal enterprises. The basement levels of St. Augustine contained not just holding cells for current students, but a fully equipped medical facility where Dr. Henley had been forced to participate in what Father Sterling called spiritual interventions. The pharmaceutical supplies Thomas had traced through shipping records were being used not just to control living students, but to stage convincing deaths for those who could no longer be safely maintained. Charles Randolph was found in the final stage of Father Sterling's elimination process, heavily sedated with opiates and showing signs of systematic poisoning designed to mimic the symptoms of consumption. According to the medical charts Martha found, he was scheduled to die of respiratory failure within the week, with his death to be reported to his family as the tragic result of spiritual exhaustion combined with weak constitution. But Charles was not the most horrifying discovery in the seminary's underground chambers. In a section of the basement that appeared to be Father Sterling's private study, Thomas and Martha found detailed records of the entire Virginia arrangement spanning 12 years of operation. The files contained not just information about current students and their families, but comprehensive documentation of Father Sterling's systematic expansion throughout colonial society. The operation had grown far beyond simple extortion of wealthy families. Father Sterling had used the intelligence gathered from imprisoned students to manipulate business deals, political appointments, and legal proceedings throughout Virginia and neighboring colonies. He had documentation of slave trading violations, tax evasion schemes, fraudulent land deals, and political corruption involving dozens of prominent families, judges, and colonial officials. More chilling was the discovery that Father Sterling had been selling some of this information to British agents operating in the colonies, effectively making St. Augustine Seminary a center for espionage against American commercial and political interests. The fees paid by families for their sons' education had been supplemented by substantial payments from British intelligence services seeking compromising information about colonial leadership. But the most devastating revelation was contained in Father Sterling's personal correspondence with his British contacts. The letters revealed that the entire seminary operation was designed not just for profit, but as part of a systematic effort to destabilize colonial society by compromising and controlling influential families. The British had been funding St. Augustine Seminary as part of their strategy to maintain influence over American commerce and politics, even as colonial independence movements were growing. The students imprisoned in the basement weren't just victims of individual family scandals. They were casualties in a larger conflict between competing imperial interests, sacrificed to maintain British intelligence advantages over colonial society. When Thomas and Martha attempted to evacuate the surviving students, They discovered that Father Sterling had been prepared for exactly this possibility. The seminary's staff, who had appeared to be simple religious instructors, were actually armed guards with military training. The building itself had been designed as a fortress, with multiple levels of security and concealed weapons throughout the facility. The confrontation that followed revealed Father Sterling's true nature as neither religious fanatic nor simple criminal, but as a sophisticated intelligence operative who had used religious authority and family desperation to create one of the most effective espionage networks in colonial America. "You understand," Father Sterling told Thomas as armed men surrounded the rescue party, "that exposing this operation means destroying every family whose secrets we've documented. Your own family's slave trading violations alone would result in criminal prosecution, financial ruin, and social disgrace that would follow your descendants for generations." He gestured toward the files containing documentation of the Randolph family's illegal activities. "Your brother Charles possesses detailed knowledge of shipping manifests, financial arrangements, and business relationships that could destroy not just your family, but dozens of others throughout Virginia's commercial network. His continued existence represents an unacceptable risk to operations that benefit the Crown's interests in maintaining colonial stability." Thomas realized that Father Sterling wasn't just threatening individual families. He was threatening to expose a network of corruption that would destabilize Virginia's entire social and economic structure. The choice wasn't between saving his brother and protecting his family's reputation. It was between preserving colonial society's facade of legitimacy and revealing the systematic corruption that made that society function. "The choice is simple," Sterling continued. "Allow us to complete our arrangements with the students currently in residence, and their families' secrets remain protected. Attempt to interfere with our operation, and we release documentation that will destroy the reputation and financial stability of every prominent family in Virginia." But Thomas Jefferson Randolph had spent months preparing for exactly this confrontation, and he had not come to St. Augustine Seminary alone. The resolution of the St. Augustine Seminary crisis required sacrifices that would reshape Virginia's political and social landscape for decades to come. Thomas Jefferson Randolph's months of investigation had led him to a conclusion that Father Sterling had never anticipated, that the only way to destroy the seminary's operation was to expose the very corruption it was designed to exploit and protect. Working with Martha Henley and a small group of colonial officials who had discovered their own families were being compromised by Sterling's intelligence network, Thomas had developed a strategy that would sacrifice their social standing to save their children and destroy British intelligence operations in Virginia. On the morning of May 18, 1799, coordinated raids by colonial militia seized St. Augustine Seminary and arrested Father Sterling along with his staff of British agents. Simultaneously, Thomas Jefferson Randolph and 17 other prominent Virginia families publicly confessed to the illegal business practices, political corruption, and social violations that had made them vulnerable to Sterling's operation. The public revelations were devastating to Virginia's social order. Families that had dominated colonial commerce and politics for generations found themselves facing criminal prosecution, financial ruin, and social ostracism. The Randolph family's confession regarding their slave trading violations led to the largest criminal investigation in Virginia's colonial history, ultimately exposing systematic violations of both colonial law and federal maritime regulations by dozens of prominent families. But the strategy worked. By voluntarily exposing their own secrets, the families involved removed Father Sterling's primary leverage over them and eliminated the British intelligence advantage that the seminary had been designed to provide. The confessions were carefully coordinated to reveal criminal activities while protecting information that could compromise colonial military or political interests in the growing tensions with Britain. Charles Randolph and 18 other students were rescued from the seminary's basement chambers, though their physical and psychological recovery would take years. The medical treatments they had received left several with permanent neurological damage, and all of them struggled with opiate dependency that required ongoing medical supervision. Charles never fully recovered his memories of the years before his enrollment at St. Augustine, and he retained the personality changes that had made him compliant with his family's business interests rather than critical of their ethical implications. 23. Bodies were discovered in unmarked graves on the seminary property, confirming that Father Sterling's operation had indeed been systematically murdering students who proved too difficult to control or who retained too much dangerous knowledge. The victims included sons from some of Virginia's most prominent families, young men whose deaths had been explained to their parents as the result of spiritual exhaustion, consumption, or other natural causes. Father Sterling himself disappeared during the raid on St. Augustine Seminary. Despite extensive searches, neither he nor several of his key associates were ever found, leading to speculation that they had escaped to British territory or been evacuated by their intelligence handlers. The mystery of their fate would persist for decades, contributing to ongoing fears that similar operations might be continuing elsewhere in the colonies. The exposure of the Virginia arrangement had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate families involved. The revelations about British intelligence operations in colonial society contributed to growing tensions between American colonists and British authorities, accelerating the political movements that would lead to the War of 1812. Several of the families compromised by Sterling's operation became strong supporters of American independence movements, seeking to prevent future foreign manipulation of colonial society. More immediately, the scandal led to systematic reforms in Virginia's commercial and legal systems. New regulations were implemented to prevent the kind of systematic corruption that had made Sterling's operation possible, and oversight systems were established to monitor religious and educational institutions receiving students from multiple families. But perhaps the most lasting impact of the St. Augustine Seminary scandal was its effect on how Virginia's elite families raised their children. The tragedy demonstrated that family secrets could be turned into weapons against those who kept them, and that protecting children sometimes required exposing the very scandals that parents sought to hide. Thomas Jefferson Randolph never fully recovered from the experience of discovering that his family's commercial success had been built on systematic criminal activity, and that his brother had been sacrificed to protect those crimes. Though Charles survived his imprisonment, the relationship between the brothers was forever changed by the knowledge of what their family had been willing to sacrifice to maintain their social position. The ruins of St. Augustine Seminary stood empty for nearly 50 years after the scandal, with local residents reporting strange sounds and unexplained lights in the abandoned buildings. When the property was finally purchased for development in 1847, workers discovered additional underground chambers that had not been found during the original investigation, along with documents suggesting that Sterling's operation had been even larger and more systematic than previously understood. This mystery shows us how the pursuit of social respectability and financial success can corrupt even the most fundamental bonds of family loyalty and religious faith. When families become willing to sacrifice their own children to protect their secrets, they create vulnerabilities that can be exploited by those who understand that desperation makes people capable of almost anything. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed about the Sterling family's operation, or might there be other secrets still hidden in Virginia's hills? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. The darkness of human greed runs deeper than most people realize, and only the bravest souls dare to explore its depths. See you in the next video, where we'll uncover another tale that shows how far people will go when money and reputation are at stake.